Okay, so let's dive right into this Iran-Israel situation because, wow, there is a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, it's been really heating up.
It feels different this time.
It is different, yeah.
It's not just sort of the back and forth that we've sadly almost gotten used to in that region, right?
Right.
What sources are you... We're looking at a lot of reporting. Obviously, this is a huge international story, but what are some of the things that you've been digging into to kind of get ready for this deep dive?
Yeah, so obviously just keeping up with the major outlets, your AP, your Reuters, your BBCs of the world,
Yeah.
to kind of track the initial attack and then the reactions and the sort of the back and forth.
Yeah.
But then digging a little deeper, right? I mean, you've got to go to, the Israeli press. You got to go to, well, I guess not the Iranian press so much in this case, but
Well, and you do, and actually some of that stuff is very interesting just to sort of see how they're framing this, right? I mean,
absolutely.
because they're framing this as, a defensive measure, right? This was
Right.
us protecting ourselves.
Right.
Meanwhile, you've got Israel who's like, I don't think so,
Not even close.
So, I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do, right? Is look at all these different sides, look at how everybody is framing this.
Right.
And sort of give people, because it's very easy to get lost in the weeds here, right?
Absolutely.
So we're going to try to do that. And I think the best place to start is, well, first of all, just acknowledging what happened, right? This is Iran's largest ever missile attack on Israel.
By far.
This is a big deal. They're using hypersonic missiles. They're claiming a 90% accuracy rate, which is, I don't know if you're a military strategist, but that's seems very high to me.
Yeah, that raises some eyebrows for
Yeah.
sure, especially when you're talking about, Israel, which has this very, touted, sophisticated air defense system, the Iron Dome and all that. So
Right.
if they were able to get that many missiles through, that really does say something.
So that's one of the things I think is important as we kind of go through all of this is looking at some of these details and figuring out, like, what does that actually tell us,
Yeah,
Because there's the headline and then there's sort of what's lurking beneath the surface.
totally.
And that 90% accuracy rate, I mean, that seems intentional, right? They're trying to send a message.
It's hard to imagine it's not.
Yeah. Right. It's not just about the missiles. It's about the message those missiles are sending.
Exactly.
Okay, so that alone is, I think, pretty wild. But then you get the casualty count, which is also very strange.
Very strange.
One reported fatality so far.
Right.
I mean, obviously one is too many.
Of course. Yeah.
But for an attack of this scale, that's strange, right?
It's incredibly unusual.
Yeah.
And that's one of those details where you have to stop and you have to think, okay, if this was purely about inflicting the maximum amount of damage, you think they would have aimed for more densely populated areas, you think the casualty count would be much higher.
Right.
So the fact that it's not, it really does suggest that there's something else going on here.
It almost feels like it was intentional, right? Like that was part of the strategy.
Right. It's hard to avoid that conclusion when you really look at the facts on the ground, so to speak.
So we've got this attack. We've got this very sort of deliberate seeming accuracy rate. We've got this very low casualty count.
Right.
And it's very easy, I think, for folks to be like, well, what led to this? But I actually think it's more important to look at, first of all, how did this happen?
Right.
Like what led up to this moment? Because this didn't just come out of nowhere.
No, not at all.
So let's back up a little bit.
Sure.
And I know you've been, knee deep in all of this. So what are some of the key things that you think are important to understand about the events leading up to this attack? Because things were already pretty tense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this has been building for quite some time. You have Israel's been sort of increasingly active militarily, particularly in Lebanon. They recently launched like a ground operation there.
Oh, significant.
Which is very significant. And, of course, you've got the ongoing conflict in Gaza, which, we're coming up on a year of that now. It's just been dragging on. And that's been a major flashpoint, obviously.
Right. And I think it's very easy to kind of forget about that just with everything else that's happening in the world and the fact that it's been going on for so long. But yeah, a year of conflict, that's
a long time, yeah.
And then, of course, you have Iran framing this attack as retaliation, not just for those things, but also for, the killing of some of their militant leaders, right?
Exactly. And they've been very explicit about that, this is revenge. This is, payback for what they see as, Israeli aggression and U.S. support of that aggression.
And we're going to get into the whole U.S. side of this too, because that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Oh, another can of worms, yeah.
But I think it is interesting how Iran is sort of trying to position this as like, we didn't start this, you know?
Right.
Like we were reacting to what we perceived as threats,
Right.
which again goes back to that idea of perspective, right?
Feasibility, yeah.
Because their perspective is very different from Israel's perspective on all of this.
Right.
So we've got this kind of powder keg of existing tensions, right?
Yeah.
And then this missile attack is like, boom, you know, just
Lights the fuse, yeah.
lights the fuse,
Yeah.
and suddenly everything is much more volatile.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's what makes this so concerning, right? Is that this isn't just a one-off event. This is like, this has the potential to really spiral.
It has the potential to drag the entire region into a wider conflict, which is, frankly terrifying.
Right, and we're going to talk about that, sort of the potential consequences of all this.
Yeah.
But I think before we go there, it's important to understand, like, who are the key players here?
Right.
Because it's not just Iran and Israel, right?
No, it's never that simple in the Middle East, is it?
No, it never is. It's never that simple. So we've obviously got Iran, we've got Israel, but then we've also got Hezbollah, right? Who plays a very significant role in all of this.
Huge role, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about Hezbollah and kind of, what their involvement in all of this is?
Sure. So Hezbollah, just for folks who might not be as familiar, it's kind of a two-headed beast, right?
Yeah.
They're a political party in Lebanon. They have seats in the parliament. They're a very powerful political force. But they also have this very potent military wing.
Right.
And they are absolutely backed by Iran. I mean, Iran provides them with money, weapons, training, the whole 9 yards.
They're a proxy, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, you can call them that, although they don't necessarily like to be called that, but they are definitely a key part of Iran's regional strategy. And they have a long history of conflict with Israel as well.
Right. So they're not just like a neutral third party here.
No, not at all.
They're very much involved. And their involvement, I think, adds a whole other layer of complexity to this because it's not just a bilateral conflict.
Exactly. And it makes predicting how this is all going to play out that much more difficult.
Right. Because you've got to factor in, like, okay, if Israel retaliates, which they've vowed to do,
Right.
how does Hezbollah respond?
Right. Exactly.
Does that bring them into the conflict more directly?
Yep.
And then what happens in Lebanon?
Exactly. It's a ripple effect.
It's a giant mess, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then on top of all of that, you've got the U.S. just kind of, hovering over all of this.
The big elephant in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, the big, well, not even in the room, right? Because they're not actually there.
No, they're ever present, even when they're not physically present.
Right. And they've already come out and said, we stand with Israel, blah, blah, blah.
Severe consequences.
They're real silly, all that. Right, all that jazz. But, like, what does that actually mean?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels very familiar.
Very much so.
But there's this one detail that I wanted to ask you about because I found this very interesting, and I'm curious to get your take on it, which is that apparently the U.S. Navy actually intercepted some of the missiles that were headed towards Israel.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting because it's not something that was like, front page news.
Right.
But it was in one of the reports that I was reading, and I was like, hold on a second, what?
That's huge, if true.
Right, like that suggests a level of involvement that we're not really talking about, right?
It really does make you wonder, like, how deep does this go?
Yeah.
And what does it mean for the future? Right.
Right, because if they're already, shooting down missiles, what happens if things escalate further?
Exactly. And how does Iran interpret that? I mean, do they see that as an act of war? Do they see that as, justification for further escalation on their part?
It's a very slippery slope, this whole thing.
Very much so.
It's like, where do you even go from there,
Right.
If you're already at the point of intercepting missiles, like, what's next?
Yeah, and it's not like this was, a couple of stray missiles. We're talking about a coordinated attack, a large-scale attack. So
Right.
The fact that they felt the need to do that, it really does,
It raises the stakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we've got a lot to unpack here.
We do.
And I think, one of the things that I keep coming back to is, we've talked about Iran's perspective a little bit, right? We talked about how they're framing this as a defensive measure, retaliation, all of that.
Right.
But I'm curious, like, how is Israel responding to all of this? Because I can't imagine they're just like, oh, okay, well, that was fun.
Oh, no. They are not happy.
No.
I mean, they have condemned this attack in the strongest possible terms.
Right.
Calling it, an act of war, an act of aggression, a provocation. I mean, they are They are using all the words.
Right.
And they have vowed to retaliate. I mean, there's no question about that.
And what does that look like, potentially?
Well, that's the big question, right? And I think, anyone who tells you they know exactly what Israel's going to do is probably lying to you.
Right.
Because they have a lot of options on the table.
Right.
I mean, they could respond with, airstrikes. They could target, Iranian-backed facilities in Lebanon or Syria.
Right.
They could even, some people are even talking about, the possibility of a ground invasion of Lebanon, which would be, that would be a whole other.
That would be a whole other ballgame. Yeah, so, it's hard to even, speculate at this point because they have so many options. And I think part of it depends on, what their calculation is, right? What are they trying to achieve with their retaliation?
Right. Are they trying to just, punish Iran? Mm-hmm. Are they trying to send a message? Are they trying to deter future attacks?
Right.
It's all on the table right now.
And it feels like a lot of this hinges on that, what does that response look like? Because that will determine, I think, to a large extent, how this unfolds.
It could very easily escalate things.
Right.
If they go too far, if they hit a target that, results in a lot of civilian casualties, for example.
Right.
That could easily spiral out of control very quickly.
Right, because then you've got, even more pressure on Iran to respond, and then who knows where it goes from there.
Yeah. It's a very dangerous game of tit for tat that they're playing.
Yeah, it's a very scary situation, I think. And
it is.
I think it's easy to get lost in the weeds of all this, like we were saying earlier. But I think it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical chess game, right? There are real people who are being impacted by this.
Oh, absolutely.
We've talked about the potential for escalation, the potential for a wider conflict, but even just the attack itself, right?
Sure.
that had an impact on people's lives.
Of course. Yeah. Even if the casualty count is relatively low, which, thank goodness it is, but
right.
The psychological impact of something like that, the fear, the uncertainty, that's real.
Yeah. And I think it's very easy to kind of, be removed from that when we're sitting here, thousands of miles away,
right,
talking about it in this, kind of abstract way. But it's important to remember that there are people who are living through this right now as we speak.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, it's easy to get caught up in the horse race aspect of it, who's winning, who's losing.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the real victims of any conflict like this are always going to be the civilians who are caught in the middle. Right.
And I think it's also important to remember that, we're only getting, a very small slice of what's actually happening, right?
Yeah.
We're relying on, media reports, we're relying on, government statements.
Right.
But there's a whole lot that we don't know, and probably a whole lot that we'll never know.
Yeah. And I think it's important to maintain, a healthy degree of skepticism about everything that we're hearing, right?
Right.
Because everybody has an agenda. Everybody's trying to spin this in a certain way.
Right.
So, take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and be wary of anybody who claims to have all the answers, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the reality is, this is a very fluid situation. It's changing by the hour.
Yeah.
And we're all kind of just, trying to make sense of it as we go.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think, as we sort of wrap up this part of the conversation, I'm curious to get your take on, what are some of the key things that we should be watching for in the coming days and weeks? What are the indicators that things might be moving towards, further escalation or, hopefully some kind of de-escalation?
Sure. Yeah. I think, the first and most obvious thing is going to be Israel's response.
Right.
What do they do? How do they do it? When do they do it? All of those are going to be really important factors.
And then how does Iran respond to that?
Exactly. And how does the U.S. respond?
Right.
Because, they've made it very clear that they're backing Israel up. But, how far are they willing to go?
Right.
And then, of course, you have to look at the broader international community, right?
Right.
What role are they going to play in all of this? Is
there any hope for, a diplomatic solution here?
That's a good question.
Or are we past that point?
It's hard to say, I think, there are always people who are working behind the scenes to try to, find a peaceful resolution.
Right.
But whether or not they're going to be successful, that's really anybody's guess at this point.
And are we at the point where, other countries might get involved? Is there a possibility of this becoming, a regional war?
I mean, it's definitely a risk. You've got to consider all the alliances, the rivalries, the historical baggage in the region.
Yeah.
It's like a tinderbox, and one wrong spark could set the whole thing ablaze. It's scary to even think about it.
And what about the human cost of all of this? We've been talking about like the geopolitics, the military strategy, but like there are real people caught in the middle of this, right?
Absolutely, and we can't lose sight of that. I mean, we've already seen the devastating consequences of the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. The civilian suffering is immense, and any escalation would only compound that tragedy.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
It really is. It's a stark reminder that behind all the political maneuvering, the military posturing, there are real lives at stake.
So, as we try to wrap our heads around all of this, what are some of the key things we should be watching for in the coming days and weeks? What are the signs that this might be headed toward, either further escalation or hopefully some kind of de-escalation?
We'll keep a close eye on Israel's next move. Their response will be telling. Will they retaliate with a measured, targeted strike, aiming to deter further Iranian aggression? Or will they opt for a more forceful, comprehensive response, potentially targeting Iranian military assets directly? The type and scale of their retaliation will be incredibly significant.
And what about the U.S.? They've been very vocal in their support for Israel, but will that translate into concrete action? Are we going to see boots on the ground?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The U.S. is walking a tightrope here. They want to project strength, unwavering support for their ally, but they also understand the risks of getting dragged into a direct conflict with Iran. So watch for any shifts in U.S. rhetoric, any troop movements, any deployments to the region. Those will be the clearest signals of their intentions.
And what about the international community? Is there any hope that they can play a role in, mediating a resolution, preventing further escalation?
It's tough to say. The UN has, of course, issued its standard calls for restraint, for dialogue, but their ability to actually enforce anything is limited, as we've seen time and time again. Keep an eye on key players like Russia and China. Their stance on this, whether they support or obstruct international efforts for de-escalation, will be very influential.
So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of potential for things to go very wrong very quickly.
Absolutely. This is a pivotal moment, not just in the Iranian-Israeli conflict, but for the entire region. The decisions made in the coming days and weeks could have far-reaching consequences.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on.
It is.
But, as always, we'll continue to follow this story closely, and we'll be back to break it all down for you as it develops.
Absolutely.
For now, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll talk to you soon.